I played the '94 World Cup in the United States, and I had an agreement with Arsene that if a team comes and pays $2 million, I'm allowed. I was almost 30 years old.
In the summer of 1994, Jürgen Klinsmann stepped off a plane and into English football, carrying a World Cup winners' medal, a goal record that scared defenders across Europe, and a reputation that made half the country want to test him before he'd even pulled on a shirt. He wasn't welcomed. He was sized up. The question that followed him from his first training session to every Saturday afternoon for the next year wasn't whether he could score, it was whether he could take it. Whether he could survive the men who'd already decided he didn't belong. These are the names he never forgot. I am Oliver, and this is Sport Icons. Most footballers from that era will tell you it was just business. Hard, but fair. Nothing personal. Neil Ruddock didn't bother with that excuse. He admitted it. He targeted Klinsmann, and he did it deliberately. And he was comfortable enough with that fact to say so out loud years later. That kind of honesty is rare. It also tells you everything about the environment Klinsmann walked into. Ruddock was Liverpool's defensive enforcer at the time, a big, physical centre-back who understood that his job wasn't just to stop attackers, but to make them regret showing up. Against most opponents, that was tactics. Against Klinsmann, it became something more personal. The fouls weren't random. They came early, they came often, and they came with commentary attached. Ruddock knew exactly what Klinsmann's reputation was, and he used it as a weapon. You're a diver. You go down too easy. Let's see how you handle this. The diving reputation was already following Klinsmann before he'd played a single Premier League minute. He'd come from a continental tradition where contact and exaggeration sometimes blurred together, and English football in the 1990s had zero tolerance for any of that. Ruddock understood that if he could connect the physical punishment he was inflicting with the public narrative already circling Klinsmann, he could get inside his head. Every time Klinsmann reacted to a foul, Ruddock could point to it. Every time the crowd groaned, Ruddock won twice. What made it worse was that Klinsmann was actually one of the most intelligent, self-aware players of his generation. He knew exactly what was happening, and his response to it became one of football's great moments of controlled defiance. The famous diving celebration at White Hart Lane, arms spread wide, hitting the turf theatrically after scoring on his Spurs debut, wasn't random joy. It was a direct answer to every man who'd used that label to diminish him. He took the mockery, absorbed it, and turned it into something the crowd would remember forever. Ruddock had spent months trying to break his composure. Klinsmann scored and took a bow. But here's what gets lost in the celebration story. Behind that moment was a sustained campaign of physical targeting that most players would have crumbled under. Ruddock wasn't the only one, but he was the one who went on record. And there's something chilling about that admission when you sit with it. This wasn't a player who got carried away in a heated moment. This was a man who made a plan. He decided before the match that Klinsmann was the target, and he executed it. Week after week, Klinsmann kept playing. He kept scoring. He won the Football Writers Association Footballer of the Year award in his first season in England, which remains one of the more remarkable individual achievements in Premier League history when you understand what he was navigating off the ball. The goals were the easy part, relatively speaking. The harder thing was walking onto that pitch knowing exactly what was waiting for him and doing it anyway. Ruddock was personal. What came next was bigger than one man's agenda. Vinnie Jones turned it into a culture. Vinnie Jones never needed to admit anything. With Ruddock, the hostility was personal, targeted, calculated, one man's campaign against one specific opponent. With Jones, it was never that simple. What Jones represented wasn't a grudge. It was a worldview. And in 1990s England, that worldview had a lot of company. Jones built his entire identity around a version of football that valued toughness above everything else. Not tactical intelligence. Not technical quality.
Toughness.
The ability to take pain, to dish it out without flinching, to stand in the middle of a physical storm and refuse to move. That was the standard. And by that standard, foreign players, with their continental technique and their emotional expressiveness and their tendency to react when fouled, were automatically suspect. They hadn't proved themselves by that measure. Until they did, they weren't fully real. Klinsmann was everything that culture looked at sideways. He was gifted in a way that felt almost decorative to the men who prized graft over grace. He moved with an ease that looked effortless, which in English football at the time was almost an accusation. Work harder, dig deeper, show us you can suffer. The unspoken rule in that dressing room culture was that a player only earned his place by absorbing punishment without complaint and any sign of reaction. A wince, a fall, a raised hand to the referee was evidence of weakness.
Or worse, dishonesty.
Jones policed that line, not with any formal authority, but with the weight of a man who embodied everything the Old English game believed about itself. He wasn't just playing football, he was defending a tradition. Foreign imports were tolerated when they arrived, but they were watched carefully. The first time they went down under a challenge, the jury filed out. The verdict usually came quickly. What's worth understanding is that this wasn't purely malicious. Some of it was genuine belief, a sincere conviction that the English game operated at a different standard of physical courage and that protecting that standard mattered. Jones wasn't performing toughness for the cameras, he lived it. The problem was that a culture built entirely around physical dominance has no framework for evaluating what else a player might bring. It can't see past the test it has already decided to apply. Klinsmann passed the test, eventually. The goals kept coming, the performances kept landing, and even the most sceptical corners of English football couldn't argue with the numbers by the end of that first season. But Jones represented the gate that every foreign player in that era had to walk through, whether they liked it or not. Some didn't make it. Klinsmann did. But the gate was real, and it was heavy, and Jones wasn't the only one holding it. Stuart Pearce carried the same mentality onto the international stage. The difference was, with Pearce, it got personal in a completely different way. Stuart Pearce didn't need a personal grudge to make Klinsmann's life difficult. He had something more durable than that. He had a reputation, a nickname, and an entire national identity wrapped up in the way he played football. Psycho wasn't a label Pearce rejected. It was one he wore with quiet pride. And when Klinsmann crossed his path, whether in a Premier League fixture or pulling on opposite international shirts, Pearce brought all of that with him onto the pitch. Their collisions were the kind that left marks, not just physical ones. Pearce played every challenge as though something beyond the game was at stake. For him, it probably was. He represented a particular strain of English footballer who understood toughness not as a tool, but as a moral position. You didn't show weakness. You didn't react. You stood up and you got on with it. That code ran through everything Pearce did. And when he faced a player with Klinsmann's continental background and expressive style, the clash wasn't just physical, it was philosophical. What made these encounters different from the Ruddock situation was the absence of personal malice. Pearce wasn't running a campaign. He didn't need to mock anyone or use the crowd as a weapon. The pressure he applied came from something harder to argue with, sheer, sustained intensity. Every match against Pearce was a referendum on whether Klinsmann could operate at full capacity, while someone systematically refused to give him a centimetre. Most of the time, Klinsmann answered that question correctly, but it cost something each time. Tony Adams presented a different kind of resistance entirely. Where Pearce was fire, Adams was architecture. He organised defences the way a general organises a line, deliberately, precisely, with total conviction that his approach was correct and everything else was inferior. His early scepticism toward foreign players wasn't hostile in the way Ruddock's was. It was structural. Foreign players didn't fit the model he'd grown up inside, so they were viewed as complications rather than assets. Adams was the heartbeat of Arsenal's defence and a central figure in the England setup for years. When a man of that stature looks at a foreign import with open doubt, it ripples outward. The dressing room reads him. The back four reads him. The attitude spreads without anyone needing to say it explicitly. Klinsmann would have felt that ambient scepticism every time he lined up against an England defence Adams was anchoring. It wasn't shouted at him. It was built into the defensive shape, into the challenges that came a half-second harder than necessary, into the collective refusal to treat him as anything other than a problem to be managed. The revealing detail about Adams is what came later. He softened. He spent time in European football, encountered different cultures, and genuinely updated his thinking. That openness is worth crediting. But the fact that it required a conscious effort to change tells you how deep the original skepticism ran. It wasn't casual prejudice that evaporates under pressure. It was a conviction shaped by years inside English football's particular belief system that had to be actively dismantled. Both men eventually gave Klinsmann something close to respect, but they gave it on their own terms, after he'd proved himself by their standard, on their pitch, in their conditions. That was the deal. Survive us first, then we'll talk. Ince and Keane had no interest in that kind of gradual accommodation. They made it combative from the first whistle. If Pearce and Adams controlled what happened near the goal, Paul Ince and Roy Keane controlled everything before it. They weren't defenders reacting to a threat. They were the engine, the men who decided, before the ball even moved, what the temperature of a match was going to be. And when Klinsmann was on the opposite side, they turned that temperature up. Ince was a force of nature in that England midfield. Physical, combative, with a sense of territorial ownership over every square metre he occupied. He didn't just compete for the ball, he competed for the right to be on the pitch, and he expected everyone around him to do the same. International encounters with Klinsmann carried that charge. There was no quarter offered, no softening in the second half, no moment where Ince decided the point had been made and eased off. The intensity held from first whistle to last, because for Ince, dropping it even briefly felt like surrender. Keane operated on a similar frequency, but added something else entirely. A running commentary on what football was supposed to look like, and a clear verdict on players who didn't meet that standard. His contempt for diving and theatrical reactions wasn't hidden. He broadcast it. Keane believed that football had a code, and that code demanded honesty under pressure. You took the challenge. You got up. You didn't look for the referee. Anyone who deviated from that risked earning his active disapproval, which was not a passive thing. Klinsmann's reputation entered the room before he did. By the time Keane had absorbed every column written about continental players going down too easily, every debate about whether foreign imports really belonged in the English game, Klinsmann had already been filed under the wrong category. The goals didn't immediately reclassify him. The reputation stuck, and Keane had no interest in revising it during a match. That's the particular cruelty of arriving with a label already attached. You have to disprove it in real time, under pressure, against the hardest men in the league. What made this pairing so difficult to navigate was the psychological weight of it. Ruddock had been one man with a personal agenda. Jones had been a cultural position. Pearce and Adams had been a defensive philosophy. But Ince and Keane together represented something more suffocating, a shared standard held by the two most influential midfielders of their generation that Klinsmann failed on sight. Every match against teams they commanded became a test he hadn't agreed to take. His answer, as it had been from the start, was to score. Not to argue, not to appeal to anyone's sense of fairness, but to keep finding the net until the numbers made the argument for him. The Football Writers' Award was mentioned earlier, but what it actually reflected was a man who absorbed this level of opposition week after week and still finished as the standout individual performer of his season. Ince and Keane defined what hard looked like. Klinsmann scored past it anyway. They were players. What Souness did was different. He handed the hostility a microphone. There's a specific kind of damage that only a TV studio can do. A bad tackle hurts for a week. A pundit with credibility and a primetime platform can shape what millions of people believe about a player for years. Graham Souness understood how that room worked, and the opinions he brought into it weren't soft ones. Souness had spent his playing career as one of the most physically dominant midfielders Britain ever produced. He'd won titles, he'd commanded dressing rooms, he'd played in an era where the hardness of a man was the first thing measured, and everything else came second. When he moved from the pitch to the booth, he carried that entire value system with him, and continental players, with their different relationship to contact and their different emotional vocabulary on the pitch, didn't sit comfortably inside it. Klinsmann's arrival in England coincided with a moment when British football was being forced open. The Premier League was starting to attract genuine world-class talent from outside the island, and not everyone in the game welcomed that shift. Souness gave that resistance a voice. When he questioned the legitimacy of diving, when he pushed back against the theatrics he associated with continental football, she was speaking for a generation of British football men who felt the game they'd built their identities around was being diluted by people who played it differently. The thing about punditry, though, is that it operates on reputation. When Souness said something, it landed with the weight of everything he'd achieved.
A bad tackle from Ruddock bruised Klinsmann physically.
A dismissive verdict from Souness on a Saturday night broadcast bruised him publicly, in front of an audience that trusted the man delivering it. The diving label that had followed Klinsmann from Europe got reinforced every time a voice like that treated it as settled fact rather than contested narrative. What's worth noting, and what Klinsmann could never fully control, is that the media verdict outlasted the playing one. The goals, the award, the performances, they were right there in the record. But narratives built in broadcast studios have a way of persisting long after the evidence has moved on. Souness represented the institutional weight behind that narrative. Not a personal grudge, but something harder to shift. A cultural conviction dressed up as analysis, delivered with total confidence, week after week. Klinsmann kept scoring. The record is clear. But the story that got told about him in England often had less to do with what he actually did and more to do with what men like Souness had already decided he was. Klinsmann walked into English football as a world champion and spent his first season being tested, targeted and talked down to by some of the hardest men the game has ever produced. He survived every one of them. The hostility didn't break him. It just showed you exactly what English football in the 1990s was willing to do to protect itself from the outside world. Drop a comment below with which name surprised you most, and subscribe for more stories like this one.